Welcome to Season 2 of Public Health on Call, a podcast from the Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health. I'm Joshua Sharfstein, Vice Dean for Public Health Practice and Community Engagement, and a former Secretary of Maryland's Health Department. Our goal is to bring scientific evidence and experience to the public health news of the day through informative interviews with scientists, community leaders, policy experts, public health officials, clinicians, and more. If you have ideas or questions for us to cover, please email us at publichealthquestion@jhu.edu. That's publichealthquestion@jhu.edu for future podcast episodes. Today is October 12th, 2020, Indigenous Peoples Day, and I speak with Dr. Melissa Walls, Director of the Great Lakes Hub for the Center for American Indian Health at Johns Hopkins. An expert in the prevention of diabetes and substance abuse, Dr. Walls is herself a member of the Bois Forte and Couchiching First Nation. We speak about the importance of Indigenous Peoples Day, both for correcting misunderstandings about the past and for appreciating opportunities for the future. Let's listen. Dr. Walls, thank you so much for joining me here on Indigenous Peoples Day to talk about this holiday. Let's start with a little bit of a background for people who may not be so familiar with Indigenous Peoples Day. What is this holiday? When did it get started and why?
Well, thanks for having me, Josh, and happy Indigenous Peoples Day 2020. So this is a holiday I think not everybody knows about. Most Americans probably think about this day as Columbus Day because it's celebrated on the exact same day, the second Monday of October here in the U.S. And this was a movement that really started in the late 1980s, actually originated in South Dakota, and is all about addressing the erasure of the history of Indigenous peoples in the land that we now call America, and the promotion of this other narrative, which is one that most of us probably learned in grade school, this idea that, Columbus sailed the ocean blue and landed and quote unquote discovered these lands. And the narrative that we're taught is one of savages who needed to be civilized. But the reality is much different than that. And so Indigenous Peoples Day is about trying to reclaim that reality, retell those stories, and promote a more just and realistic narrative of who Native people are in this country.
So it sounds like this is both about the past and the present.
Absolutely. Indigenous Peoples Day at once is about retelling that history, as I mentioned, but it's also really about the narrative of Native peoples in America today. So I think of all of the racial ethnic groups in our country, it seems to me that Native peoples are subject to the most stereotypic kind of representations. Part of it has to do with, for example, mascots, which we know have been in the news a lot recently. And this idea, again, of these almost savage portrayals of brown people with feathers in their head. Right. The other narrative
cowboy and Indian movies.
Cowboy Indian movies, yeah, the Hollywood Indian portrayals, Dances with Wolves. So on the one hand, we could be romanticized, at one with the earth. And I think there's that famous or infamous commercial from the 70s or 80s of that person who was portraying a Native American standing on the side of the road. And he had the one little tear that came down when he saw the garbage on the side of the road because, it was hurting the earth. So these sort of caricatures become what most Americans think of as Native Americans. But the reality is we are all sorts of things, right? We come in all shapes, sizes, and colors. We have professions like doctors, lawyers, teachers, judges, professors. We are activists. And there's a term that I really like to describe from American Indian studies, which is called Native survivance, which really speaks to moving beyond a victim narrative of Native peoples. So moving beyond the story of just colonized beings to active resistors, activists, people fighting for just causes.
Let's talk about that concept in the context of health. There are stories people tell about the health of Native Americans.
Yeah, absolutely. I think the number one health story about Native Americans is probably the portrayal or the stereotype of the drunken Indian. It was one that I grew up with. It's one that many Native people internalize and believe. I think if we were to pull articles, published articles on research with Native communities, alcohol use and abuse and drug use is at the top of what we study, myself included. And the reality is that there's so much more to Native communities. So first, a little fact checking. We know, for example, that in the United States, Native Americans and Asian Americans are the two groups most likely to not drink alcohol at all. They're the highest abstainers, right? But the story we get is that Indians are drunk all the time. We do know that some of our communities suffer from the consequences of sporadic substance abuse. And I think that what we learn in our research is that that comes from, norms of use as opposed to sort of genetic predisposition, which has been refuted in a number of studies. So when I think, common stereotype is backed up by research attention, we kind of reinforce what we already thought we knew about Native communities. And so if we take the spirit of Indigenous Peoples Day, this idea that there's so much more to the story, we need to tell a more just, a more balanced portrayal of what Native communities are, then we as public health scholars, researchers, practitioners have a responsibility, I think, to include those types of things in our studies, highlight those stories and when we write things about and with Native communities. And carrying that spirit forward, I think, creates a more equitable, realistic, and actually empowering agenda for research that just plain feels better.
If the subject is substance use disorders, for example, then it's important to not just talk about the challenge, but to evaluate the responses and what works, what kinds of approaches are effective, and learn from those perhaps for other communities as well.
Absolutely. So I think Native communities have been actually at the lead in prevention science overall, championing these strengths-based approaches. And centered in strengths-based approaches are cultural and community assets that all communities, not just Native communities, have. But when, like you say, when we focus solely on the problem and perpetuate these deficit cycles, what is the problem? How do we address the risk factors? How do we address the problems again and again and again, right? We miss out on this whole opportunity to learn about the mechanisms of positive change, pathways to recovery. Who are the people maintaining sobriety? Who are these abstainers that are the majority of our community members? And what is it about them that we can learn to inform other communities who might be struggling with these issues? Those questions are less commonly asked in research, but are becoming more and more the topic of importance, in part because of this larger movement, again, that I think Indigenous Peoples Day represents.
How are these concepts reflected in your own research?
Well, it's been an evolution, to be honest. So when I first got into this world of academic research, it was a family affair. My uncle was serving as a community-based liaison to a university research team. He was living on our family's reservation in northern Minnesota. And I was recruited to go to graduate school to learn how to study substance use with Native communities. And I went into this having really internalized growing up this story about Native people as those who have problems with substances. And I really have had to work hard on decolonizing my own mind. So as a concrete example, I have a few people in my family, don't we all, who've had substance use issues in their lifetimes. But I had to really come to a place to realize those were the exceptions, not the norms. I had to evolve academically, personally, professionally, to expand my own worldview of what it meant to be a Native person. I had really started to believe the things that were being taught to me on screen and in history books. And so when it came to research, that professional journey involved really putting my pen and my money where my mouth is. So I could talk and write about strengths-based research or, the need for us to give a more balanced narrative. But was I really measuring it in the studies I was leading with tribal partners? honestly, elders would come to our meetings and say, here we go again, another article that we're publishing about, drug use. Mm-hmm. And I would say, yeah, but that's what we want to study, right? And, it's many lessons of humility later, and I'm still on that journey. I can say that we try really hard to balance, for example, the questions we put in a survey to be not just deficits driven, but more holistic, focusing on sources of strength, sources of resilience, stories of sobriety in the case of substance use, for example. And so it's an ongoing journey, but it's required me to think really hard and reflect on things I learned in graduate school and try to be, a bit more revolutionary, which is very sad about the way that we approach this.
And maybe let's talk for a little bit about the tremendous contributions of this kind of work to health more generally. I know that there have been some groundbreaking vaccine studies, for example, on reservations that have led to the adoption of vaccines that have saved millions of lives. I know you're also doing work on food access and diabetes. What are the kinds of things that you think the indigenous populations essentially can teach others about pathways to health?
Well, I think there's a lot of things that our communities have to offer. There are two robust predictors of health that we find in our work across Native nations, and those are factors related to community and to culture. Now, those are big categories, but I think what Indigenous science is showing me, and when I compare it to sort of the general body of science, I think has much to offer, is that when we drill down into those big buckets, so what is it about community that actually promotes health? Is it just social support? No. Is it communal mastery? There's ways that we can really drill down to find mechanisms to promote well-being. Those are some of the lessons we're learning. In addition, culture. What does that even mean? And in Native communities, culture often conveys something about tradition and historical approaches to culture, but also means contemporary ways of manifesting a post-colonial way of being. And that matters also for other Native communities. So you also mentioned vaccine trials and biomedical research. I need to mention that the Center for American Indian Health here at Johns Hopkins was founded by Matu Santosham, and his work in collaboration with the White Mountain Apache communities led to what is known today as oral rehydration therapy and has saved millions of lives across the globe because of issues that were happening in Native communities and Native community members' willingness to do the hard work to save their own babies, right? And so that the stories go on and on and on. The list is quite long. But I do think that the main message here is research with Native communities offers endless lessons to science generally.
What would be some illustrative examples?
As I mentioned earlier, two robust indicators of well-being in Native communities are community and culture. And wow, do those two things matter today? We are living in a time of social isolation. We relate to one another through these visual platforms. You and I today are talking from thousands of miles apart. We yearn for that social fabric of, and even just being in the proximity of other human beings. We are social animals. And I think the way that Native scientists and people working with Native communities have drilled down to really think more concretely about the mechanisms of social and cultural integration that matter for well-being has relevance for all of us. So, for example, decades of research, if not more, have told us that social support is good for humans. If you're being supported, you have better health. And that's true for Native communities as well. But what we find in our research is that social support, of course, it doesn't exist in a vacuum. It's related to other things like, are you able to feel like you can get things done because your orientation is more communal in nature? This idea of communal mastery. Do you feel a sense of loneliness even if there's people around you or not? Do you have people you can rely on? So, in the scientific world, we'll talk about this in terms of like social networks or other measures of social well-being, but I don't see those relational aspects of health so concretely explored in other science as I do in Indigenous community science.
Got it. That's very helpful. So this is a day not just to learn about the big picture and think about the big picture of Indigenous peoples, how they've been treated in the past, the reconceptualization that is necessary to understand their real role in history, but about what's happening now and the value of Native communities and Indigenous people, including for health.
Absolutely. And I think it's all connected, right? So if we accept the prevailing history written in classic textbooks about Native people as a peoples of the past, how could we ever imagine a contemporary society where we have anything to offer? If we rewrite that history, if we reclaim that history, if we educate one another about a more realistic version of what has happened in these lands, then we can see those opportunities. Then we can engage in partnership. Then we can give the respect that is deserved. Then we can honor the survival and the survivance of Native communities. It's all a nice little package that comes together on Indigenous Peoples Day.
Well, thank you so much. Happy Indigenous Peoples Day. And really appreciate your joining me for the podcast.
Yeah, it's great. It's great to talk to you. Thank you.
Public Health on Call is produced by Joshua Sharfstein, Lindsay Smith-Rogers, Stephanie Desmond, and Lamari Morales. Audio production by Spencer Greer, Niall Owen McCusker, Cian Oates, and Matthew Martin, with support from Chip Hickey. Distribution by Nick Moran. Thank you for listening.